She didn't announce it like a confession. She didn't soften it with regret. She didn't wrap it in apology or nostalgia. When Dakota Johnson said, "I made my choice," she wasn't closing a romantic chapter. She was seizing control of a narrative that had been quietly hijacked for nearly a decade. And the reason that sentence landed like a detonation across Hollywood wasn't because of who she chose, but because of who she finally refused to orbit around any longer. That's the part people miss. Because what unfolded between Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan was never just chemistry, never just on-screen magic, never just a fandom fantasy that spiraled out of control. It was something far more uncomfortable, far more consequential. A slow-burn collision between restraint and desire, between public image and private gravity, between a woman learning how power actually works in Hollywood and a man who had built his entire life around not disrupting it. And when Dakota finally stepped out in that silver gown, smiling as cameras flashed and headlines formed before she even spoke, she wasn't glowing because she was in love. She was glowing because she was done being misinterpreted. Look closely at that night and you can see it in her posture. The stillness, the absence of nervous performance. This wasn't a woman seeking validation. It was someone who had already decided. And in Hollywood, decision is power. For years, the public had treated Dakota and Jamie's connection like an unfinished sentence. Every glance replayed, every pause dissected, every interview mined for subtext. Fans didn't just speculate, they invested. They built an emotional economy around the idea that something real had been stolen from them, interrupted by inconvenient marriages, moral boundaries, timing, responsibility. But that framing was always wrong. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was interrupted. What existed between them survived because it was constrained, because it was never allowed to beck. That's why it lingered. From the moment 50 Shades exploded into the mainstream, Dakota and Jamie became trapped in a paradox. Their characters were reckless, consuming, volatile. Yet behind the scenes, both of them were guarded, deliberate, deeply aware of what lines could never be crossed without consequence. That tension didn't dilute the chemistry, it sharpened it. And what the audience responded to wasn't lust, it was restraint under pressure. The sense that two people understood each other without ever giving themselves permission to act on it. But restraint, over time, becomes a form of power imbalance. Jamie Dornan was already living inside a completed structure. A wife, children, a life deliberately anchored away from Hollywood excess. Northern Ireland wasn't a coincidence. It was a boundary. He didn't just value privacy. He weaponized it as a form of control over chaos. Dakota, by contrast, was still in motion, still becoming, still learning how quickly the industry would assign meaning to her body, her voice, her relationships. And while Jamie had something to protect, Dakota had something to claim. That difference matters more than chemistry ever could. Because while fans romanticized their what if, Dakota was slowly realizing something else entirely. That being emotionally understood by someone doesn't mean they're capable of meeting you where your life is going. And that realization is rarely dramatic. It doesn't arrive as heartbreak. It arrives as fatigue. The fatigue of being projected onto. The fatigue of being frozen in a moment that refuses to evolve. And this is where the story quietly shifts, long before Chris Martin ever enters the frame. Dakota didn't drift toward peace because she was afraid of intensity. She drifted toward peace because she had already lived inside a heightened emotional atmosphere that couldn't go anywhere. Late-night conversations that circled instead of progressed. Shared silences that felt profound but resolved nothing. Emotional intimacy without logistical possibility. It's intoxicating at first. Then it becomes a loop. And loops are dangerous because they simulate depth without offering direction. Chris Martin represented something that had nothing to do with music, fame, or even romance. He represented forward motion. Emotional availability that didn't require secrecy. A rhythm that didn't spike and crash. A man whose life had already survived implosion and learned how to rebuild with intention. Where Jamie embodied unspoken understanding, Chris embodied permission to breathe. That contrast wasn't accidental. It was strategic. But the public didn't see strategy. They saw sentiment. They saw Dakota choosing calm, as if it were a retreat rather than an advance, as if peace were the absence of desire instead of the result of discernment. And that misreading is precisely why her words hit so hard when she finally said them out loud. I made my choice. Not, I fell in love. Not, I moved on. Not, it just happened. A choice implies agency. It implies alternatives. It implies awareness of consequence. And Jamie Dornan understood that immediately. Because what that sentence really said, beneath the elegance, beneath the composure, was this: you were never the future. You were the threshold. Publicly, Jamie did what he has always done. He absorbed it, smiled, responded with grace, offered respect without commentary. But privately, that kind of declaration forces a reckoning no amount of discipline can avoid. Not because he expected her to choose him, but because he had grown accustomed to existing as an unresolved presence in her story. And closure, when it arrives without negotiation, can feel like erasure. This is the unspoken cost of emotional restraint. You don't get to complain when the moment passes. Dakota didn't owe him anything. She never did. But that doesn't mean the impact wasn't real. Because for years, Jamie had occupied a rare psychologue position. Not her partner, not her past, not her fantasy, but her mirror. Someone who saw her complexity without demanding access to it. And mirrors are comfortable, until the person reflected grows beyond the frame. When Dakota stepped fully into a future that no longer required ambiguity, Jamie was left with something far more unsettling than heartbreak. Irrelevance to a chapter he never fully entered but never fully exited either. And that's why his silence afterwards mattered more than any confession ever could. He didn't spiral publicly. He didn't contradict her narrative. He didn't reclaim the story. He withdrew. From interviews, from nostalgia, from the mythology itself. Because once a woman claims authorship over her own meaning, the men who once occupied symbolic space within it lose the ability to define themselves through proximity. The world moved on quickly. Hollywood always does. New couples, new rumors, new obsessions. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. A line had been drawn, not between two men, but between two versions of Dakota Johnson herself. The woman who once existed inside possibility, and the woman who now demanded trajectory. And if you think that was the end of it, if you think I made my choice was closure, then you've missed the most important consequence of all. Silence is often mistaken for dignity. In reality, silence is where power retreats when it no longer knows how to operate openly. After Dakota Johnson said, "I made my choice," the industry treated the moment like resolution. Headlines closed the loop. Fans recalibrated. The story they assumed had reached its natural conclusion. But emotionally, psychologically, culturally, that was only the beginning. Because when a narrative collapses, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. And the first place it mutates is inside the person who never believed they would need to speak at all. Jamie Dornan had built his entire public identity around control without confrontation. He was the man who never overshared, never escalated, never contradicted the version of himself the world found most palatable. The devoted family man, the grounded actor, the quiet counterweight to Hollywood excess. That image wasn't fake, but it was curated. And curation, when tested, reveals its limits. For years, Jamie had been insulated by ambiguity. He didn't need to explain the connection with Dakota because it was never formally acknowledged. He didn't need to define it because the world did that for him, softly, sympathetically, romantically. He existed in a liminal space where restraint was interpreted as virtue and distance was mistaken for depth. But Dakota's declaration shattered that illusion. Not loudly, not cruelly, simply by naming reality. And naming reality removes refuge. What followed wasn't heartbreak in the cinematic sense. There were no public breakdowns, no emotional confessions, no dramatic reversals. What followed was erosion. A slow, internal recalibration where every past moment is reprocessed under a new truth. Every silence becomes heavier. Every unspoken exchange is stripped of its protective romance and revealed for what it was: hesitation. Jamie didn't lose Dakota in the way people lose lovers. He lost the version of himself that believed restraint would indefinitely preserve significance. That's a far more destabilizing loss, because restraint only functions as power when it's voluntary and shared. Once one person steps forward, decisively, publicly, the other is left standing still. And standing still in a culture obsessed with momentum is indistinguishable from falling behind. This is why Jamie's withdrawal after Dakota's announcement wasn't accidental. It wasn't simply privacy. It was damage control, not of reputation but of identity. He stopped engaging with the mythology because mythology no longer served him. It now framed him as the man who didn't act. The man who let something rare remain hypothetical. The man whose values, however honorable, had quietly cost him something irreplaceable. And that realization doesn't inspire drama. It inspires silence. Meanwhile, Dakota was undergoing a very different transformation, one that the public misread almost entirely. Her relationship with Chris Martin was described as calming, grounding, mature. Those words sound gentle, almost passive. But what they really signaled was alignment. For the first time, her private emotional world and her public trajectory were moving in the same direction. Chris didn't represent safety because he was quiet. He represented safety because he was clear. His life had already been dismantled once. His fame had already collided with intimacy and lost. He understood consequence not as theory, but as experience. And that made him dangerous in a way Jamie never was. Dangerous because he didn't need fantasy to feel alive. Dakota wasn't choosing less intensity. She was choosing sustainable intensity. The kind that doesn't rely on secrecy or speculation to stay charged. But clarity has ripple effects. Once Dakota stopped orbiting ambiguity, the industry began subtly repositioning her. Interview questions shifted. Her language sharpened. She stopped performing relatability and began projecting authorship. And this is where the real tension emerges, because Hollywood tolerates independence far more easily than it tolerates self-definition. When a woman defines her own emotional narrative, she disrupts an entire economy built on interpretation. Fans noticed it before journalists did. The way she spoke about love without inviting projection. The way she refused to validate nostalgia. The way she redirected conversations away from longing and toward intention. She wasn't erasing the past. She was contextualizing it. And context is threatening to fantasy. Jamie, by contrast, remained frozen in the version of the story that no longer existed. He continued to speak respectfully, thoughtfully, carefully, but the space he once occupied, the unsaid, the maybe, the almost, had collapsed. And once that space is gone, there is nowhere left to stand without declaring something. And declaration was never his method. This is where loyalty becomes a paradox. Jamie's loyalty to his family, his values, his chosen life had always been framed as moral strength. And it was. But morality doesn't protect you from consequence. It simply explains it. There's a quiet cruelty in doing the right thing and still losing something you never technically possessed. Because there's no villain to blame, no betrayal to point at, only timing, only self-restraint, only the knowledge that love, left unacted upon, doesn't remain pure. It evaporates. Rumors surfaced quietly, as they always do, that he reached out, that there was a message, a final exchange, not to reclaim, not to disrupt, but to acknowledge, to close the loop properly. No confirmation ever came. And in some ways, that absence is more revealing than any disclosure could be. Because real closure doesn't announce itself. It simply changes behavior. And behavior changed. Jamie threw himself into work, but not with the hunger of ambition, with the discipline of avoidance. New roles, new sets, new environments, anything that kept him from being alone long enough to replay the past without romantic lighting. Yet even immersion has limits, because memory doesn't require permission. A headline here, a photograph there, a Coldplay song bleeding into a quiet moment, and suddenly the ache returns. Not sharp, not jealous, just heavy. The ache of knowing that the version of yourself who might have acted no longer exists. Dakota, on the other hand, began speaking in a register that only comes after something has been resolved internally. When she talked about love, it wasn't wistful. It was precise. She spoke about peace not as compromise, but as courage. About choosing alignment over intensity. About walking away from what is beautiful but unsustainable. Those words weren't coded messages. They were declarations of authorship. And authorship changes how people relate to you. The fandom that once celebrated the mystery now struggled with the finality. They replayed old footage, dissected micro-expressions, searched for hidden meaning. Not because it was still there, but because letting go felt like erasing something they had emotionally invested in. But nostalgia is rarely about the past. It's about resisting the present. And the present was uncomfortable, because the truth had surfaced. Not dramatically, not cruelly, but undeniably. Dakota and Jamie didn't fail each other. They simply belonged to different versions of adulthood. One built on protection and restraint, the other on expansion and choice. Neither wrong, but incompatible. This is the quiet violence of growing up. By the time Dakota and Chris Martin's engagement became official, the story had already moved beyond romance. It was now about consequence. Jamie didn't comment publicly. He didn't need to. His silence had become the commentary. And when asked carefully, politely, about connections that shaped him, his answer carried the weight of someone who understood that meaning evolves. Every person who's ever mattered to me still matters, just in different ways. That sentence wasn't closure. It was acceptance. And acceptance is what remains when fantasy has no place left to hide. But the story doesn't end there. The truth is, love rarely ends with fireworks. It ends in echoes, in reverberations that shape lives quietly, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. By the time Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan had publicly closed their chapter, she with 4 words, he with 4 gestures of silence, the real story had already begun. It was no longer about chemistry or heartbreak. It was about consequence, identity, and the subtle architecture of choice. Dakota's decision didn't simply remove Jamie from her narrative. It redefined the space she occupied in the world. Hollywood thrives on ambiguity, on stories that can be endlessly mined, repackaged, and monetized. A woman who speaks definitively, who refuses speculation, who refuses to make herself an accessory to fantasy, disrupts that ecosystem entirely. Her choice rippled through the industry, quietly signaling that agency, clarity, and alignment were not just possible but inevitable when pursued relentlessly. Chris Martin's presence was emblematic, not incidental. To the casual observer, he was calm, grounded, the safe haven she needed after years of intense scrutiny. But strategically, he was much more than that. He represented a reality where love is not a spectacle but a partnership, where private alignment takes precedence over public expectation. Dakota's move was audacious because it asserted that she would no longer subordinate her emotional life to the expectations of others, whether the audience, the industry, or even past intimacies like Jamie. And that audacity created tension not only in her personal life but across the very machinery of Hollywood storytelling. Jamie's response was equally instructive. To the casual eye, he had moved on quietly, resuming work, maintaining composure, and observing restraint. But beneath the calm exterior, the effect of her choice was profound. Silence, in his case, became a form of survival and a statement of principle. By not chasing, by not commenting, by not performing anguish, he retained dignity but at the cost of unresolved internal gravity. Every award ceremony, every press tour, every headline bearing her image subtly reinforced the truth he could not change. Dakota had chosen herself, and in doing so, had irreversibly reshaped their dynamic. In his absence, the unspoken narrative shifted, not in favor of closure, but in favor of reflection. And reflection is a dangerous companion. Jamie had always been methodical, a man who weighed risk, morality, and consequence in equal measure. Yet Dakota's action revealed the subtle asymmetry of their past. Restraint had preserved his image, yes, but it had also cost him influence, intimacy, and an undeniable stake in a story that mattered to him. Where he had assumed endurance would protect him, he discovered instead that inaction had limits, that unspoken connection, however profound, is insufficient when the other person claims authorship. What remained was not anger or jealousy, but the quiet ache of potential unrealized. The recognition that sometimes the most meaningful stories are those you cannot participate in, no matter how closely you are connected. Meanwhile, Dakota flourished in the public eye, not merely because she was loved, but because she was in motion. Every engagement, every carefully considered public appearance with Chris Martin, every interview framed with precision, conveyed a singular message: autonomy. She had navigated a world where speculation and fantasy often overshadow substance, and emerged not as a subject of gossip, but as a sovereign agent of her own narrative. That distinction, subtle yet potent, altered the perception of everyone around her: colleagues, fans, the media, and even those who had once been closest to her. Yet even amidst this apparent triumph, there was an enduring undercurrent, the residue of a connection that had been deeply formative. The moments she shared with Jamie were not trivial. They were foundational, teaching her lessons that shape her understanding of intimacy, timing, and emotional intelligence. But those lessons were not meant for perpetuation. They existed in a liminal space, instructive and powerful precisely because they could not continue. For Dakota, the choice to step forward was both an act of courage and a pragmatic negotiation with reality. Sometimes, to survive and thrive, one must leave beauty behind. Hollywood never forgets a story like this. The arc of Dakota and Jamie became a template, quietly referenced whenever the tension between public perception and private truth surfaced elsewhere. It demonstrated that chemistry, even when genuine, cannot override circumstance, timing, or individual growth. That restraint, while admirable, has its limits. That clarity, even when difficult, carries transformative consequences. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed the cost and reward of agency. In claiming your own path, you risk alienating those who inhabit your past, but you also claim the freedom to design your future. For fans, the narrative often appeared romanticized. A tragedy of timing, a bittersweet what might have been. But the reality was far more instructive. It was a study in power, in emotional intelligence, in the long-term implications of decisions. Dakota's choice, while personal, was also emblematic of a broader truth. Agency cannot coexist with ambiguity. In every life, moments of indecision or passive consent may protect relationships, reputations, or appearances temporarily, but they exact a cumulative toll that manifests in regret, resignation, or unresolved longing. Jamie, for all his composure, confronted that truth silently. He did not seek to rewrite the past, did not attempt to reclaim the narrative, did not betray his principles. And in doing so, he exemplified the other side of the lesson. Restraint, when aligned with integrity, preserves dignity, but cannot prevent the inevitability of change. Theirs was a story without villains or heroes, only actors navigating the delicate architecture of circumstance, character, and consequence. In the end, the legacy of Dakota Johnson's decision is neither triumph nor loss, but clarity. It is the assertion that emotional autonomy is both possible and costly, that choice reverberates far beyond its immediate context, and that love, real, transformative love, cannot survive where it is constrained by expectation or proximity. It is a lesson in timing, power, and the quiet courage required to align life with intention rather than obligation. And for Jamie Dornan, the legacy is equally profound. In silence, in reflection, in measured action, he embodies the consequences of restraint, the limits of connection, and the truth that sometimes love's greatest act is letting go. Not with anger, not with regret, but with recognition of what was, what is, and what will never be repeated.